Good evening to tonight's Sunday Night Live. Hopefully this month slightly brighter and slightly louder than last month, where I realised that you couldn't really see me in the dark and I wasn't loud enough. Tonight we've got I think a wonderful programme. I might be biased, but I was still fascinated when I was filming it a couple of weeks ago. It's from Billingshurst Chapel, which is one of our success stories, and Stuart Coop from that chapel interviews the Reverend Richard Bokey, and he's had a pretty amazing life, and I thoroughly enjoyed making the film, and I thank both of those two people. Just before we get on to that, just a couple of notices. It's going to be a very busy month. Next weekend we're at the Unicomms conference, and quite a lot of that conference is going to be streamed live. It's a bit of an experiment, but we are pretty confident that you can watch the sessions on Friday evening, Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon and Saturday evening. So if you can't make can't make the weekend, at least you can join in and get something from the weekend. It may not go completely smoothly, but we are moving forward, and I'm sure that there will be some of it that will be streamed live. I'm sure it will be good. So please join us on this channel if you can. And later on in the month we have the Vision Day, the 21st of November, and at 10:30 we will have the session in the morning, and then we'll have at least one session in the afternoon, but we're still working out what we can do during that day. But again, it's trying to make that Unitarian event more accessible. Just before we go, I'm going to post in a moment. I'm going to post a couple of photographs actually on the UK Unitarians Facebook page. The first one is a photograph I took about 3 days ago when we were in Edinburgh as a family, and it was just wonderful to see, going around Edinburgh, that there were signposts to the Unitarian Church. And I know it sounds very, very simple, but it was just lovely to see that. What was more wonderful was in the park finding a bench which has sat there for 50 years to celebrate the General Assembly went to Edinburgh in 1963. So for 50 odd years everybody who sat on that bench has seen the word Unitarian. But the one I really want people to look at is this one. We went to a cafe, and there was this wonderful tree that somebody had drawn on the wall, and its sentiments were just so beautiful. I just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if some of our churches had artwork like this in it? So I'm going to post this actually on Facebook so you can actually read it and see it. But it really inspired me, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful, and I really wanted to share that with you. But we'll now go on to tonight's programme. As I said, from Billingshurst. Really hope you enjoy it. It's 30 minutes, but it's got some very, very interesting bits in it. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Billings, who has served in churches both in England and across the United States. Richard, before we sort of get into the heart of what we want to speak about tonight, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia during the Depression, 1931. My dad was a builder, and work got scarce. He had to travel around a little bit on jobs. We moved with him. My mother had been a college gym teacher. We moved to Iowa, then to Florida, then back to Atlanta. There were no black police in Atlanta. There were some good black colleges. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Morehouse, for example, which is a good college. I was baptized in the all-white Baptist church near us on Peachtree Road, and at 16 I joined my brother at Georgia Tech.
So you were brought up with the church around you,
Yes.
as it were. What led you to want to take a career, as it were, within the church?
It happened more after I left Georgia Tech after 2 years because I felt I wasn't being happy as an engineer. Okay. And I took sort of what amounted to a general course, and there I could take sociology and I could take religion. It had a much broader scale of what you could study. And I had two good sociologists. One had us do what he called psychodrama. And he cast me, typecast, I think, in the role of minister in a conflict. And that was one place where I got it. And he would sometimes talk to me after class about what I was doing and so forth. And he turned out to be a member of a strange group that I hadn't heard of called the Unitarians. And that's where I got acquainted with Joe Gittler, who actually left a legacy to the association as a scholarship. I got a good recommendation from him and from the religion professor, who was an Episcopal priest. And they both wrote me good letters to Divinity School at Yale, and I was accepted.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time at Yale?
I had housemates who were Japanese Christians, and there was a gym to play volleyball in. The Japanese Christians helped inspire me to take a summer job opportunity at a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico, which at the time was a closed city for making atomic bombs. And it was fascinating. There on July 5th, I remember, I gave my first sermon, and it was largely attacking Senator Joseph McCarthy and his government institution. And I got a lot of very friendly, quiet thank yous from the audience, some of whom knew they were under investigation.
When you left Yale and graduated, what was your... did you have a plan of any course?
It was 1954. The Korean War was still on, so somewhat winding down. I decided to apply to be a U.S. Air Force chaplain. It's much better to be an officer than a buck private if you can help it.
Why that choice?
Did want to stay in religion, I decided. So I was going to try it out.
What are your vivid memories of that time?
The experience of seeing 35 bombers loaded with atomic bombs. And what had brought this on? It was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Probably the closest thing to war we came to since World War II. President Dwight Eisenhower warned Britain not to invade. As the invasion was in progress, he ordered a full alert for the Strategic Air Command and its about 700 bombers to load up with atomic weapons and prepare for their targets. This was really to say to Russia, look, if you go in and attack these people in the canal, we've got to retaliate. And they got the message. I looked at the lead bomber, and you couldn't close the bomb bay doors on it because the bomb was so big. And I asked the captain, how big is this thing? He said, oh, it's many times Hiroshima. I thought about that, and I thought, this is crazy, that we in fact launch these things. We not only destroy human life on Earth possibly, but destroy much of Earth itself. So I started heading toward being a peacenik rather than a chaplain. We had another situation at the base that really changed things. When you first got a B-47, you could do loop-de-loops. But unfortunately, after 17 years, the wings got what they call metal fatigue, and wing broke. And the group captain and the base commander and 2 officers were killed in the plane. And the base commander was probably going to be buried with Army troops and so forth coming in. However, one person on the plane would not accept going there. That is, the wife said, no, I won't participate in that. I want you to do the service, chaplain. And I had 500 people in the chapel and 500 outside listening on the microphones. And I did all right, I'm glad to say. But no service has ever quite scared me as much since.
And to what extent do you think that these experiences early on in your career with the US Air Force have shaped your thinking?
Well, they certainly shaped my thinking about being a war resistor and being, I'm not totally against armaments, but I am saying, let's be clear about this, never again with atomic bombs. And in fact, I'm against Trident because it's too much temptation if you have them too long to use them. Also, I have respect for the Air Force, and I've learned respect for some of the people there who were trying their damnedest to do the best they could.
So you left the chaplaincy for the US Air Force, and then what did you do?
I had to find out what I could do to be a Unitarian minister, and I went to Emory to sort of sit in on a course by a philosopher named Charles Hartshorne. At one point, I just talked to him after class. I said, I've got a choice. I've been told I can go to one of 3 schools to get put into Unitarian ministry. I can go to Starr King, or I can go to Meadville, or I can go to Harvard.
Yep.
Which should I choose? He just said Harvard, obviously. So I went to Harvard, and it was a great experience. Took 2 courses in world religions by wonderful people. And in one of them I met Houston Smith, who's become a lifetime friend, who's written a book called The World's Religions, which has sold over 2 million copies. I would say the most important thing that Houston was to me was a friend I could talk with who treated me as an equal. And now and then I gave him advice, which is, after talking to his wife, I didn't do it very often, but what it was, his original title for his book was The Religions of Man. And I said to Houston, if you don't change the title on this and get the man out of it, it's not going to sell much anymore, because really feminism has said we want to be treated as equals. So he listened, his wife agreed with me, and he went back to his typewriter and started transforming it. He added a new chapter on primal religions. He lengthened the chapter on Islam. He learned more. He revised some other things. And he changed over 3,000 verbs and references so that would no longer be anything that just said man. And it took him a year, but then he sold another 1 million books.
Yeah.
And it was generally agreed, it was the standard textbook for about half the colleges teaching religion for about 10 years.
And still well used today.
Yeah, right.
So you left Harvard with your Unitarian piece of paper in hand.
That's right.
And what happened next?
They asked me to go to Chico, California. And I also had a fellowship in Reno, Nevada. And the best part of the job in many ways was driving over the Sierras between them.
I'm led to believe that things didn't quite go as planned at Chico.
The 3 leading contributors to Chico, a stockbroker and 2 doctors, said, we want you to resign. And it was clear that I would have the majority of the congregation supporting me, but I asked them why. They said, because Louis McGee, who's assistant minister down in Los Angeles, would like for once in his life to serve as the minister of a majority white church. Louis McGee was a Negro.
Okay.
I agreed to resign, and I went to Starr King that summer, taking courses, but no job. Went to see a girlfriend in Chicago, went by the Unitarian office, said to me, hey, we've got a call for you. You are to fly to Flushing, New York. They want to interview as the candidate for their church.
Tell us about New York City in 1961.
Oh yes, New York City. Well, this was a fascinating place to be. About a week after I arrived, the district executive in New York said, how would you like to house 2 students? So I had 2 students from Kenya who lived with me. One was Luo, the same tribe as the father of Obama. And the other was Kamba. They had to move out when I got married about 3.5 years later, but this was a good experience. What happened the first year I was there was, partly because I had these 2 Kenyans living with me, I was asked to take a trip to Kenya. So I called one of the members of the church who worked for Lufthansa. And I said, what can you get me going to Kenya? He called back the next day, well, I can get you to Kenya, all right, that's no problem, but for $150 more, you can fly around the world. So I said, okay, let's do it. And I called Boston, I was doing this, and then they said, oh, well, you can stop here in India, you can stop here in the Philippines, you can stop here in Japan. And so first I had a month in Kenya and Uganda, but it was a wild thing, and the thing that was, well, there were many good things that happened on the trip. I was ushered around by Tom Maboya, who was one of the leaders at the time.
So by the time you were 30, you'd had a couple of ministries, the US Army, you've been to Harvard, Yale, and travelled around the world.
Yeah, right. This is by 31, yes.
Okay. And then you were back in Washington, or back in the States in 1963. In
1963, I was at summer camp, a sciences and art camp run by a rabbi. This was, well, I would say, well, probably about certainly over 50% of the kids were Jewish, and this was good experience working with people, and there were some problems right along, and I was supposed to be the hiking supervisor, among other things. When it was all over, one other counselor and I were going to drive down to New Jersey, where he lived, and we got out and looked at a magazine for the first time and learned the March on Washington was going to happen the next day. We talked to each other for a couple minutes, and we agreed we're going. So we drove down to New Jersey, where he lived, so he could change, and then we drove on to Washington, got there at the first light of the morning, went over to All Souls Church, where the Unitarians were gathering, walked with them over to the March thing, which was packed with 250,000 people, and found our spot, and the event went on. It took a while for Martin Luther King to get on, but anyway, it all happened.
Yeah. Again, that must have been quite a shaping influence on later years. Your involvement in that March on Washington and being not privy to the events at that time, but certainly being really keyed in with what was going on, particularly with perhaps James Reeb, who's the Unitarian minister who was murdered.
In the spring of 1965, he was murdered in Selma, Alabama, and hundreds of ministers went to march with King, and I've been asked why I didn't go sometimes, and I said, very simply, before I got the call that they were going to support him, I'd already organized Flushing marches with Selma. And fortunately, at that point, I had good contacts with the local ministers, partly for a very strange reason. When I left to take my trip around the world, I called up a Dutch friend who's apparently a very distant relative named Rudolf Bucke, and who spoke good English, and asked him would he like to spend a month or so in New York while I'm away. And he said, sure. And so he flew over and lived with my 2 boys. And his first sermon, the rabbi was there in the church with a member of the synagogue. And the rabbi introduced himself at the end of the service. And then the friend with him said, your brother hid me during World War II. I wanted to come thank you. And I was immediately invited to the Rotary Club by the rabbi and in with the clergy of the town. So that's made a difference in many ways in my life in Flushing.
Sure. And around about this time you also travelled to Eastern Europe.
Yes, it was 1964 that I traveled to Eastern Europe with Donald Harrington, the minister of the Community Church of New York City, and his wife Vilma, who was Transylvanian. That was a fascinating tour that finished up at the IARF Congress in The Hague. And there was a family that I knew. I knew the Trapp family. This is not the ones who sing, this is the ones who preach. And Mrs. Trapp introduced us to a young lady with them who apparently had spent a year in Summit. And that's how I met my wife, Yopi. And then I caught the ship. I was sailing as chaplain on a student ship. And that's how I got my fare back and forth. And I got back home and continued a correspondence with her and then proposed by mail.
By mail?
Yes, I called her up to say that's fine. And anyway, she said she'd fly over and see what we do. And so she flew over for Christmas. But then I did something, probably wasn't the thing most husbands would do, but we talked about where we do that summer, and we went to Mississippi.
Okay.
Took over ministry at a little fellowship in Gulfport, Mississippi of Unitarians. I was very careful to put a Georgia Tech sticker on my car so it didn't just say New York license plates.
Okay.
So anyway, we didn't get any trouble till right at the very end. And right at the very end, what happened was tragic. We went to Ellisville, Mississippi, to Our Home Universalist Church. As we were reading, I said, "Where's a good place to spend the night?" to a lady sitting next to me. She looked around, she said, "Get out of town." We went to Meridian, spent the night. The next morning, we drove into Atlanta, and we happened to see Gene Pickett, the minister of the Atlanta church, and Cliff Hoffman, the district director, walking down Peachtree Street. So I stopped, and they ran out to the car and said, "You're all right." "Yeah, why wouldn't I be all right?" "You didn't hear what happened?" "No." Don Thompson, who was the minister in Jackson, had been shot in the back with buckshot. They meant to kill him, but he was a fairly heavy man, and he lived. But that was why she said she knew things were up, and it was better not to be around. And that was Mississippi in 1965.
So already widely travelled and recently married. You'd not been to the United Kingdom, though, until 1968.
Well, actually, I'd been here for an IAF Congress back in 1966, but in 1968 I took the church in Leicester, had lost its minister. They were happy to have me fill in while they looked around for 2 months in the summer. But it was also a time when I got notified by the local Democratic Club that I had been nominated as a candidate to the National Democratic Convention. Why? Because I'd been out protesting against the Vietnam War, and they knew this. And also they respected me because obviously the other clergy in town respected me. I got a notice I'd won. I'd beaten a New York legislator because I was a Gene McCarthy delegate, not Joe McCarthy. Gene McCarthy was the one against the Vietnam War out and out. So I flew to Chicago, attended things, but things got very hot in the convention. And the tensions were various there. And they had the tribute to Bobby Kennedy, who had been murdered just a few months earlier. At the end of that tribute, I happened to be sitting next to Theodore Backel. He used to be in Fiddler on the Roof, among other things. Anyway, I said to him, "Let's sing." And he said, "Okay." He stood up and started singing, "Glory, glory, hallelujah." Well, I stood on my chair by him, "Glory, glory." The whole place stood up and was singing, "Glory, glory, hallelujah," for about 15 minutes. Back in Flushing, Yopi had the convention on, and little Eleanor was about 16 months old watching. She said, "Dada, Dada." Yopi said, "No." She looked on it, sure enough, the camera was focused on me and Theodore Backel, because indeed he had started the singing. So then we went down to the hotel where people who had been beaten during the thing by the police. It had been a rough time. Some had been arrested. They didn't mess with the delegates. We had about 200 coming down in buses. And as there were 8 ministers, we were given candles to be acolytes. I lit my acolyte candle, and I turned around to the row coming up toward me, and the first candle I lit was of Arthur Miller, the playwright, better known as the husband of Marilyn Monroe at one point.
Yeah.
But it was a great experience, and so I was there in 1968 in the convention, and we did what we could.
To what extent do you think that the films about the Vietnam War portray what it was like at the time?
Well, they portray it mostly, of course, from the American side, what it was like to American troops, what it was like to what we done. My own had just a couple comments. One, I think it showed the absolute audacity, and I would even say stupidity, of some thinkers to think, hey, the French couldn't handle this, but obviously we can, we're Americans. The French had gotten blown out of Vietnam, and we should have realized that this was not something we should be immersed in. And it was really quite horrible because both Americans and Vietnamese were guilty of slaughters at times. Particularly think of cases where they had to get the body count up, and there were soldiers that came back and they were literally ill. They said, "We were told, just count all the bodies. They're all Viet Cong as far as we're concerned because that's what headquarters wants to hear." When I finally got years later in California, where the war was still winding down, I wrote a requiem for Vietnam using a text from a book called Home from the War by Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist at Yale. The requiem, thanks to our friend here, James, who's producing this show, is now available on YouTube. Okay. So that's, and he did a great job. I didn't mention one thing I should have about the Flushing congregation before we leave them behind. This was one of the most integrated churches in the UUA. We had a dozen non-white members. I don't want to say African American because some were Jamaican. One was from Curacao. They came from all over the place. And also, when the church was founded, it was integrated. The person who was there was Lewis Latimer. He was the only African American to be an Edison pioneer. Had become a Unitarian, and his wife played the organ in the church, and then their children was to remain Unitarians. In fact, Winnie, his daughter, was a good friend of mine. When it came to dedicating her a school in Brooklyn, she asked me to come do the dedication blessing.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm thankful to Flushing for giving.
I first met you in the early 1990s, I think. So how did you get from Flushing to Horsham?
Well,
and why?
New York at the time had the same pollution problem London had back then. And when my wife put out diapers to dry, they came back covered with some soot and applied for another church. And I got St. Petersburg, Florida, which was a slightly larger church. The climate was quite different. I remember our opening shades at the hotel when we got up the first morning and said, "It's Technicolor." Everything in New York was always always great. So we enjoyed that. So we had a good 5 years there, and I was all prepared to stay, but my name had gotten into Berkeley, California, and they called and said, "Will you please come out and candidate?"
Okay, and Berkeley is a huge
Well, it's a huge, yes, it was about 600 compared to the 300 or so I had in California, in Florida, and about the 250 I had in Flushing.
And Horsham has a membership of around about
Well, about
30.
25, maybe 30, yes.
So
well, I was ready to, well, it was partly for my wife. My wife, in process, had decided she wanted to be a minister.
Right.
So she went down to Pacific School of Religion and took her job as training, and she loved it. I think those were three of the best years of her life in many ways, going to school there and being part of that. But she wanted a church of her own. So she got a call to be interim minister at Essex Church in Kensington, and she took it.
Was it a shock to the system, going from huge congregation in the States, coming over to England?
There was some, well, it was sort of, first of all, it was nice to unwind a bit from having a fairly pressured situation, Any case, I learned some things there, and I have advice to give young ministers now if they want it. But I've learned, one thing I've learned is don't give advice unless it's asked for. That's important. Toward the end, I was very much sort of an honored senior minister in the community. For instance, I was asked to be on the committee hosting the Dalai Lama.
So a lifetime in Unitarian ministry, really. And although you've spanned sort of the States and the UK and various other places around the world, how do you think the movement has changed?
It certainly changed its worship pattern, at least in America, and I'd say some changes happening here too in England. If you go to a Unitarian General Assembly now, there's a lot of what used to be called happy-clappy. It used to be rather stately at times like that, but this is, there's more of a wide-open joyness. And it's actually more fun, I would agree. So there's that change. And in the worship services, many churches are trying to do the same thing. And there's more comfort with talking about worship. Now it's recognized, hey, the core of the church is contemplation and worship. It's not trying to argue about things.
So, young man in Georgia, spends a lifetime in Unitarian ministry. You would have had some hopes and dreams.
Looking back at my life, I've certainly had adventures, and I would say not all the projects that I went after worked out. Sad about some, and I'm glad about some that did work out. That's one of the things that, from that experience traveling to Transylvania, I set up relationships between our church and a church in Transylvania. And from that, I was one of the founders of what's called the Partner Church Council. And that's still going great strong, which is linked together over 250 churches in the States with other churches in places like Transylvania, the Philippines, India, even Africa now. And that's something I feel that has accomplished, and it's been good for the churches that are doing it, and it's been good for the denomination.
Sure.
So that's one. I won't try and enumerate many more, but that's the one I would say I'm most clearly proud to say.
And are you hopeful for the future of the world? I mean, you've seen times of war and peace up close.
Let's just say, having some masters like Houston Smith around, and his wife, who's also a master in a different way. She teaches meditation and calls herself a Buddhist. When she joined the church, she said, "Can a Buddhist be a Unitarian?" And I said, "In your case, Kendra, sure." And also I remember sitting with Suzuki Hiroshi, the founder of Zen Center of San Francisco, after we'd had a sitting session. And I decided to ask him the two great questions. How did the world begin? And he said, "Don't know," eating his rice. "No one else does." And I said, "Well, what happens when we die?" He said, "Don't know. No one else does." There's another Zen story where it says, the same question is asked, "What happens when we die?" And he said, "I don't know." And the student said, "But you're a Roshi." He said, "But I'm not a dead Roshi." So I would say there's a certain sense of, hey, you don't know what's going to come next.
Yeah.
And so live well the moment.
So although you've now retired from the ministry officially, you still manage to devote many hours to religion.
Oh, yes.
And to peace.
What keeps me inspired to do it is now and then seeing something happen that breaks through, and also finding some friends in interfaith from other faiths that I'm very happy to have. And I think of our friend Ayad, who's head of Crawley Interfaith, who is a Muslim, who is going to do a service together with me in Horsham on the 6th of December. And it'll be showing that both Unitarians and the best of Islam believe in oneness. That we are part of one humanity, one planet, one universe.
Dr. Boki?
Yes, well, thank you,
Minister,
sir.
and gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you.
I really hope I'm doing quite as much as that when I'm in my 80s. Thank you very much to Richard and Stuart. Stuart will be part of the Friday night session at the Unicoms conference when we're talking about recipes of success for Unitarian communities. It features three, Bridport, Lewis and Billingshurst, and they've all in their very different ways resurrected themselves. And there are huge lessons, I think, for many congregations at the moment which are rather struggling about how they can be more successful. So, see you next Friday evening, and for those also who are interested in outreach, on Saturday we have a professional communicator, Fiona Lewis from the Media Trust, that will be running a training course on outreach, and the first session will be streamed live, and then there will be a session in the afternoon. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.